welcome everyone. Also welcome to all the people in the back, in the library. Welcome to the future of the university, the Decolonial Campus. My name is Meerte Vreese and I will be your moderator this afternoon. What is or what should a university be in the 21st century? Is it merely a factory of knowledge delivering professionals to the market? Or is it an institution of social and cultural values with a responsibility towards its students and towards society? So in this series of lectures, Studium Generale TU Delft organizes several debates about the future of universities with speakers from inside university and outside. Well, I was just thinking, who sees the university merely as a factory of knowledge? Raise your hand. Yeah, 2 people, okay. And then who sees it more as an institution of social and cultural value? Yeah, a little bit more, okay. Well, we're gonna talk this afternoon about these kinds of social and cultural responsibilities. And we're gonna address the Decolonial Campus. So I think that most of you know that we live in exciting but also worrisome times. They also like societies in flux, as people say, power structures and institutions which uphold inequality and patriarchy are being questioned. And one of those institutions is the university, like in general the university, but presumably also this university. And the call to decolonize and decarbonise and to democratise universities is getting stronger, and from students, but also from academics and university staff. So the last year, the TU Delft organized already the Decolonial Knowledge series. I can highly recommend it. It's a very interesting series, but it is all online. And this afternoon, we would like to bring kind of an extra layer to the conversation by really looking into the programs of the TU Delft. For example, Rebecca Beau, who wrote her thesis on the TU Delft's global housing studio and whether it has addressed or perpetuated colonialism and neocolonialism while practicing in the global south. And we also have Dr. Fatima Delgado Medina, who teaches sustainable and circular entrepreneurship and circular human behavior. And we have writer and comedian Oyunga Pala, who is a refreshing outsider, who has a refreshing outsider's perspective with regard to the TU Delft, but who has an insider's perspective when it comes to knowing firsthand when Western NGOs enter the global south with good intentions, but a lack of knowledge and sensitivity to their surroundings. And most important, we have you. And therefore, I really would like... there's this beep. Can it go away? Because it's kind of annoying. Yeah, I also always like to know why people are coming. So if I can ask you, what triggered you to come to this event?
I really like the topic.
Yeah. Why? What is it that interests you about this topic?
So it includes the word decolonial. It was not really long back when India was one of the colony, and now it's like country in its own right.
Yeah.
And that was mainly because of the decolonial the practices of people and institutions in the country. So I wanted to know it from the perspective of university, how it can be applied and not at the country level.
Yes.
So,
and I presume you are from India then?
Yep,
Yes.
I'm from India.
Okay, good. Yeah, if I can ask you, what was the reason you wanted to come to this event?
The invite showed up somewhere in my email, and I also like the topic.
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing how TU is approaching the concept of decolonization of education.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I'm excited to hear.
Yes. Lest, you? Did you come with a certain question or already an idea about this topic, to this talk?
No, I think I'm just interested in the topic in general, and I would like to hear some opinions on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So, just for me, who is an international student or professional? Please raise your hand. like who wasn't born in the Netherlands, or who've come from abroad to study Delft. Yeah, I think it's very interesting, but also a little bit worrisome that so many of you aren't from here. And that what I mean by that is that I think it's also very important when people, who actually are from here come to listen to this topic. So a very warm welcome to the ones that did. And let's hope that online we have lots of also, how do you say that? Born and raised Dutchies, to put it like that. Okay, and then before we really start, I would like to introduce also a teacher at TU Delft, Mark van Huisden. He's sitting there in the kind of corner, and he will make an illustrations of things that will be said, and he has a very difficult task to also see if there are any conclusions to make. So after, when we finish, we will look and discuss this physical evidence of this afternoon. So now I would like to introduce Oyunga Pale. He's a pioneering satirist and columnist from Kenya, if I'm correct, right? Yes, he remains one of the most impactful columnists of his generation. He examines the texture of everyday life, moving away from the traditional idea of African men as victims of modernity and disillusion. And Oyunga, you currently live in the Netherlands, right? I'll give the floor to you.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. I'm here courtesy of Angela, who found me in a different forum. Angela is Rebecca's mother. And she said, you need to come out to Delft and share some of your insights. I come from Kenya. Has anybody been to Kenya here? Oh, nice. Yeah, so I come from Kenya. I come from the capital city of Kenya, a city known as Nairobi. Professionally, I've worked for the last 20 years as a columnist in a mainstream Kenyan paper. And then 2 years ago, my wife got a job in the Netherlands, and I came as, what do you call this, the trailing husband. And I've been trying to sort of finding my way around this lowlands. So what I want to share with you is a project I got involved with about from 2017 to about just before I came here, to the end of 2019, and it's situated in a place known as Mathare. So I think, okay, got the first slide on. When you look at that visual, it's that entire area, the surface area of Mathare, is basically one of Kenya's biggest shanty towns. It's a square kilometer area of like 3 kilometers squared, and it holds up to like about 500,000 people. So it's very deeply concentrated and has a very interesting history. In Kenya, of course, we use the word slum, but we prefer to say informal settlements, or we just try to call them homes, because once you get to know the people who live there, it's life. That is home for them, So we always challenge this idea of calling people's homes slums, just because it doesn't meet the criteria of other people. Mathare has an interesting history. It's part of our colonial legacy. When the British came to Kenya in 1906, they basically set about finding posts, and Nairobi became a major capital city for the British. And in order then to bring in the labor that would build a capital city, they created a system of urbanization that was based on racial lines. So basically, they took 60% of the country, of the city, and reserved it for a white elite, and then created a buffer for the Asians, and the Africans were on the ring in what would be our lowlands, the harshest and driest parts, and that's where Mathare came out of. So Mathare has had a continuous existing history for about 100 years now. As a result of this segregation policy, Kenya gets its independence in 1963, and the new ruling elite, of course, adopt this system of class segregation, and the structures pretty much maintain. The difference is now we've got black faces in charge, but the structure is the same. We still have a small minority elite living in the best parts of the country, of the best parts of the city, and the rest are in the slums, what we call the slums, the shanty towns. What happens then, and interesting about our urban structure, if you look at Nairobi, if you look at it from the top, if you do an aerial view, get a drone shot of Nairobi, there's almost a green belt that divides the poorer places and the affluent places. To the point, when we use the term leafy suburb, we actually mean leafy, like where there are trees and where there are no trees. It's almost a guarantee is where there are no trees are the lowlands or where poor people live, and where there are trees is where the affluent lived. To the point that when I started working in Mathare and would walk to places where there were trees, people from Mathare would never feel, they would get intimidated by green spaces. So for example, if you brought a typical Mathare boy who has never been out of Mathare and brought him to the Netherlands, he'd be very intimidated by the public green spaces, because in his mind, all private green spaces have been privatized. So this is the reality that we encountered, that we first came across. Now, as a result of this demographic, as a result of this colonial legacy, Mathare provides labor for the rest of Nairobi. But since Mathare is not part of the legal social structures, it has no sanitation, has no health provision, has no roads, and all of these things. So it becomes informal in its entire economy. As a result of that, elements, of course, will start to grow, like criminality, because this is the reality that you grow up in. You will find, for example, illicit brews in this kind of environment, and as a result of that, it gets heavily policed. Mathare, in particular, is surrounded by 6 police stations, and very strategically built because they're in affluent areas in order to, quote unquote, prevent crime. I just move it that way, the other way. So, in 2017, we had an election, Kenyan election, and typically what happens, has been happening a lot in Kenyan elections, is Kenyan democracy operates in ecosystems of violence. We call them geographies of violence, where politicians then use rival gangs against each other in order to sort of push certain interests. Mathare is one of the places that has been consistently a spot for that kind of violence. And so what happened is that extrajudicial killings became so high in Mathare that at the time we were starting the project, we were losing up to 15 kids, 15 young men a month. We had had a report, this particular report documented 803 cases in 2 years, and of the 9,000 cases that had been presented to what was called the Independent Police Oversight Authority, only 3 had been taken to court. So this is the environment in which we found ourselves in, and young men, by virtue of just being young, were profiled. So the likelihood of you getting into a police encounter and getting killed was very, very, very high, right? It was almost unusual to find anybody who had got into his 30s in Mathare. So under the group called the Mathare Social Justice Center, we decided to find a way to resolve this problem, because we knew as a small community-based organization, we couldn't take on the system. It's too powerful, it's structurally intact, you cannot change it overnight. But we figured we could do something within our immediate environment. So what we decided was to use the symbol of the tree. Now, you remember the first vigil of Mathare is that you tell anybody that you want to green Mathare, people tell you it's impossible. It's impossible. How would a tree survive in this kind of environment? There's no incentive for trees to grow here. But we insisted with the simple analogy that if a tree could survive in this environment, then a young man and a young woman could. So that became the definition that basically drove the movement. It started basically as a volunteer organization, and every weekend on Saturdays between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock, what people do is that gather trees, all the trees were volunteered, everybody volunteered their time, and they would find a public site that was formerly a garbage, because there's no real, organized public site. So it's really just spaces that have basically been overtaken by garbage. Since nobody's fighting for those spaces, you clear the garbage, and then you start the hard work of rehabilitation. And the thing about trees is that everybody can dig a hole and plant a tree in it. But to watch it survive takes time. So you have to show up over and over and over again. And then that's what creates the kind of resilience that we were trying to reintroduce into Mathare. This is an example of one of the public sites that, and this is somewhere, I guess, into its first year. I couldn't get all the visual because there were too many pictures, but typically it used to be like huge mounds of garbage. When you dig the earth in Madare, because of the years and years of garbage accumulation, you literally dig almost 1 meter plastic. You're pulling out plastic. So by the time you get trees to actually survive, not to mention that there's hardly any piped water, right? So in order for trees to survive, you have to agree with the community, the people who live around you, to agree to adopt the trees. Because the idea is that trees are part of a public common, and you have to now speak to them and tell them, listen, if the trees survive, everybody gets to benefit. So they get investment. And the way to draw everybody in was to bring the little children, to involve them in the work, and then slowly by slowly, they would get invested. But in order to make the trees survive, we introduced one other component, that we started planting trees in memory of every young man who had been shot. And what we'd do before we planted the trees, we'd invite all the family members together, and they would help plant the tree. And that's how our trees ended up surviving, because they had symbols. They became symbols of resilience. This is another one of the sites. And what we'll do is that we take all used stuff. The tires that you see there came from basically people who were throwing away, tire manufacturers who were throwing away tires. And they'll give us tires and they get recycled. And slowly by slowly, the young men would go to the walls, because the walls are very bare and stark, and they'll start creating these wall murals. You see the symbol of the fist and the tree. It's basically a fist of resistance, and we're drawing inspiration from a tree. If a tree can survive, so can we. I get it to my last slide, which sort of makes my conclusion. Madare's story is still ongoing. We realized very quickly that we were not able to resolve things overnight. We also realized very quickly that unless you actually involve the actual stakeholders, the people who live there, nothing's going to change. But we learned a couple of lessons from this experience. One is that people say it's impossible. When we start trying to do this, people said it's impossible. There is no way you can get young men in Madare to spend an entire afternoon on Saturday, morning and afternoon on Saturday, planting trees in a place where there's no water. It happened, right? When the movement was at its height, there were up to 50 people showing up every weekend. It's not possible until it's done. Number two is change is slow. That's why we use the tree. By the time a tree comes from that level to a place where it's a shade, you've got to get everybody to be interested and cooperate in the survival of this one tree. So it takes a lot of time, right? And number three is that community is everybody. Community is everything. Because once you change the logic of community, people start to understand that, this tree is going to benefit a lot more people than myself. And they get invested. And as long as you start with the stakeholders, the people who are youngest, the people whose future you're actually trying to predetermine, you involve them at the very start, it will survive. The whole future will change. That future will come to a point of realization. This is an ongoing story. I've shared a whole bunch of links that people can go and look into. But this is the Madare Green Movement, and the whole philosophy behind it, as taken by our Lobel Wangari Maathai, is that just do your little thing. Just do your little thing, and then get out of the way. Thank you.
So much. Please stay with me for a couple of minutes. Do you already have a question for Yunga? Otherwise, I have. No, not yet. Well, thank you. It was very, I think, insightful, but also symbolic for maybe the bigger story. I've heard that you say that when people from the West come in, they have this obsession. I think I have to stand here or something. They have this obsession with making impact. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's that part of the story. Now, so Madari Green Movement was an auspice of something called Madari Social Justice Center. Now, they were created as almost a counter response to the NGOization of Madari. So what had happened in Madari is that because of the government has stepped away from the informal settlements, what happens is NGOs come in, which is a lot of Westerners with really good intentions, people come and they say, this one to solve problems, this one to save people, then, you know, what can I do? The problem with that, it creates a dependency syndrome where people then just sort of sit back and wait for, so then it becomes an entire industry, almost like a donor lucrative industry, and everybody has a little pocket NGO, and there's always some funds being sent from some country in the West, and you have to show impact. So it becomes a racket, right? So then people start to look at NGO as basically any different, like a hustle, basically, a place where you can go make money. And as long as you can take a few pictures, you know, show your funders what you did with the money, and then we started to notice that 60% of the money went into administrative costs. Very little went to the actual project. So what we tried was the opposite of this, was by saying, okay, enough with the criticizing, because we can all go and criticize. Let's try a countermeasure. And the countermeasure is that, can we actually tap into our Ubuntu spirit, our communal spirit that's innate, and see if we can actually appeal to people's reason and say, hey, listen, let's just do something for the community. There's no pay, the only gain is that everybody will be happy. How's that for a deal? And surprisingly, it worked. Yeah. And with the most unlikely people, young men who were supposed to be the most distracted, who would be supposedly everywhere else, they actually showed up. And it was the counter strategy to the NGOization of Nairobi, of Madari. Yeah.
What I found also striking is the fact that a park or even a tree can feel like intimidating to a boy. You have to know so much of, you know, the culture and historical and economical context to understand that. So I think that also gave some insight in what happens when you come from outside the country, having no idea about those, you know.
That's true, because I mean, as part of the colonial legacy was that greenness always represented affluence. So what happened is that if you look at sort of like our conservation culture, some of the most beautiful parks in the world are in our country. Right now, Obama has a series on Netflix about the great parks of the world. One of them is from Kenya. And the thing about the conservation culture that was adopted as part of the colonial legacy, it's very anti-human. So everybody wants to see the animals, nobody wants to see the humans, forgetting that for hundreds and hundreds of years, these two people have coexisted. So as a result, when it came into urban centers, so-called beautiful green spaces were preserved for the elite. And so a whole generation grew up associating, we have forest guards in our forests, in our parks, as access. So a whole generation grew up associating greenery with affluence and class segregation. So we are part of that whole re-education process of saying everybody has a right to a clean and healthy environment. Yeah.
My last question is, if you were to add like one thinker or one book to the curriculum of, you know, here at the TU Delft, who do you think really should be included?
Wangari Maathai.
Who is that?
The Nobel Peace Prize winner, Nobel laureate winner for the environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah. She's written about 3 books. But Wangari, do you know Wangari Maathai?
It doesn't ring a bell with me, which is bad, I think. I'm not the only one.
The famous woman who planted millions and millions of trees in Kenya and rehabilitated our environment. Mm. Oh, you guys have to figure out who knows. Well, I mean, because at least she got the Nobel in Europe, at least, you know, as far as we remember.
Recognition,
But Wangari Maathai, so she's a Nobel, the late now. She's Nobel laureate for her environmental activism. Yes. Very quick tip is what made Wangari famous is that Wangari told we're having environmental devastation as a result of our development system. Because what happened in Kenya is that we're in a rush to industrialize, to become a middle-income country, and we started paying no attention to the environment because we seem to have all of it. We have so much trees, we have so much greenery, so you never imagine it will end. As a result of these new policies, we started having serious soil erosion and devastation. And then that creates poverty and then creates a whole cycle of social problems. One guy then goes and organizes village women, simple village women, and they become foresters without degrees. And through this networks, they call the Greenbelt Movement. In fact, that's what inspired our movement. She started a movement all over the country where women were just planting trees. And in 10 years, she greened the country again. That's what made her really famous. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Uyungapala, and I really recommend also your website because you make very interesting observations also about the Netherlands. And so thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, then now I would like to introduce to you Rebecca Beau. She is a diversity and inclusion student assistant at the African Studies Center at Leiden University, but more importantly, she's also a student here at the TU Delft, writing her thesis on what I said, the TU Delft's Global Housing Studio, and researching whether it perpetuated colonialism and neocolonialism or addressed it, especially with practice in the global south. Rebecca Beau.
Hello. Well, why don't we just let bygones be bygones? They're in the past, right? Well, as James Baldwin, the writer and activist extraordinaire, explains, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. As was introduced by Mirta earlier, the main themes that underpin the purpose of today's discussion concern inherited power structures that continue to uphold equality, TU Delft being a vehicle in order to do so. And as she said before, there have been many calls to decolonise course curriculums, and one call to do so materialised in my 10-week master's thesis titled Looking into a Historical Mirror, which can also be found on the TU Delft repository. It examines the interrelation between architectural education, colonialism, and neocolonialism, more specifically focusing on the global housing studio and how they perpetuate or address these in the global south. The thesis posits that we all, me, you, the university, have a responsibility and role in realizing social justice and equality, but to better understand what the potential responsibilities and roles of the university may be to move towards a more inclusive future, the thesis critically identifies the current actions of the studio and how it could improve in the future. We will do this by way of exploring three central themes. The first concerns intention, followed by stakeholders and power dynamics, and lastly by an examination of our value systems. I specifically examined one design studio in the architecture faculty. Nevertheless, there may be overlap with similar courses and studios across the university. As such, this presentation will focus primarily on the lessons learned from the Global Housing Studio for the wider university context as opposed to the studio itself. The questions also, to note, the questions on the slides were intentionally formulated to prompt you to reflect and develop your own understandings, which could be supplemented by the contents of this presentation today. But before we continue, let me take some time to briefly define the used definitions of colonialism and neocolonialism and establish why they're of relevance for this talk today. So, colonialism concerns the exercising of political and economic control, and specifically the movement of people from one place to another, where they become permanent settlers. Nonetheless, these populations retain their loyalty, whether that be political or economic, to their country of origin. Also to note, this thesis solely concerns European colonialism that took place between the 16th to mid-20th century. But colonialism didn't end in the mid-20th century, and it was instead replaced by neocolonialism. The term was coined by Kwame Nkrumah, a Ghanaian revolutionary and the independent country's first prime minister and president, who preferred it to the less accurate post-colonialism, as it incorrectly implied the supposed death of colonialism and its descendants. Instead, Nkrumah asserted that neocolonialism is in fact the last child of imperialism and actually the most dangerous, as it maintains colonialist agendas in more implicit ways in the modern age. But both colonialism and neocolonialism depend on and exacerbate unilateral power dynamics. This leads to a number of consequences, including significant amounts of knowledge loss, less diversity for problem solving, unmet needs due to a disregard and unacknowledgement of local realities, and growing inequality, which for the university can significantly limit its growth. Nevertheless, the Global Housing Studio, like the university as a whole, intend to, want to, and are interested in cross-cultural and geographical collaboration with partners ranging from Brazil, Ethiopia, India, and elsewhere. However, while collaborating, is there also an intention to address colonialism and neocolonialism? Well, first let me briefly describe why intentions are significant. Essentially, intentions can be defined as having a goal or purpose in mind that an individual or a collective aims to bring to fruition. In other words, it's what directs subsequent action, which mirrors that of the original reason or motivation. Therefore, it can be understood that without explicitly intending to address colonialism and neocolonialism, little change will actually occur. As was mentioned before, the Global Housing Studio and TU Delft have an intention to collaborate. In conjunction, the Global Housing Studio also has an intention to address colonialism and neocolonialism. However, compounded with these intentions to be connected to local realities, be collaborative, and henceforth foster mutual exchanges, are imbalanced power dynamics between the different stakeholders that influence the impact of these intentions. So, what is the significance of understanding the power dynamics between stakeholders? Well, hierarchy and power dynamics are an innate part of the natural world. Take wolf packs, for example, where you've probably heard of terms like alpha male, underdog, and pack mentality. However, there are many misconceptions about these terms in our culture. Where the alpha is revered and the omega is disregarded, the omega, though, plays an equally important role, albeit different to the alpha. In many canine hierarchies, each pack member assumes a role that plays to their natural strength in order for the group to survive and to live. Sadly, though, the same cannot be said of colonial and then neo-colonial social hierarchies, where a system of dominant and subordinate castes are used, irrespective of individual aptitude. Instead, race and ethnicity were determining factors in where you were positioned. In such a system, Europeans were perceived as superior with exponential and vast knowledge, while people from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were perceived as inferior. Instead, they were supposed to be subservient and convinced that they had no talent or intelligence to offer the world other than those required to serve their superiors. For instance, Violette Leduc, a renowned figure in 19th century architecture, was aghast at the immense structures of Tulum, Uxmal, and Chichen, and how they were created by indigenous inhabitants of the Americas, and instead insisted that the responsibility must lie elsewhere, namely on Europeans. Maintaining these power dynamics, though, is damaging, as it can further inequalities, the silencing of historically subordinated caste, lead to the loss of abundant knowledge that doesn't originate from these dominant caste paradigms, and lastly, the favouring of listening to historically dominant castes, despite there being deeper, more well-informed wells of knowledge elsewhere. Nevertheless, this colonial caste system was inherited by neocolonialism and the present day, where within this historical system, a European university like TU Delft assumes the role of the dominant caste, while the university's partners in the Global South assume historically subordinate roles. So how does the university address or perpetuate these asymmetries? Well, one way is by examining success and power dynamics. In colonialism and neocolonialism, success was oftentimes one-sided and for the benefit of the dominant caste. Take the example of the new alliance for food security and nutrition that was inaugurated by the Group of Eight, consisting of countries like France, the UK, and the US, as well as 10 African nations, including Ethiopia, Benin, and Senegal. Outwardly, their intention was to put an end to hunger by developing recipient nations' agricultural productivity. Furtively, though, the alliance's actions were one-sided, as they were perceived as enabling land grabbing by creating agricultural corridors that were intended to benefit the alliance's corporate partners, leaving local subsistence farmers dispossessed of their land and livelihood. In the Global Housing Studio, the university identified and continues to identify the benefits for TU Delft students. However, like the G8, their corporate partners, a unilateral power structure is in operation that renders the mutual benefit for the studio's Ethiopian and Indian partners to be less thoroughly considered. This attitude echoes Nkrumah's statement, where he asserts that practitioners of neocolonialism have power void of any moral responsibility for those who they are exercising it on, meaning that to not perpetuate colonial and neocolonial attitudes of success, as well as to equalize power asymmetries and to fill the intention of collaboration, clearly and explicitly addressing, considering, and acting on how each party mutually benefits is needed. Bounded with the idea of success and who benefits is who enables and brings success. The notion of saviorism is closely bound with justifications for colonialism. And, for example, European colonialism was often justified by so-called civilizing missions, where colonists would impart their apparently much-needed values, knowledge, and culture onto uncivilized people to elevate them from their backwards ways. This notion of saviorism is mirrored in the white savior industrial complex, although the term doesn't strictly apply to only white people. Teju Cole describes the white savior industrial complex as a space in which people from the West go to Africa to become godlike saviors under the banner of making a difference. It could be perceived that the Global Housing Studio perpetuates the white savior industrial complex when they speak of the differences between the Global South and Global North. For example, when speaking of education in Africa versus Europe, there are undertones of implicit bias favoring Eurocentric, now global, educational standards, as opposed to exploring other ways and perceptions of what it means to be educated. Moreover, when conducting projects in the Global South, the studio frames these locations in terms of the challenges they are facing. Nevertheless, the studio does not equally detail what Ethiopia, India, or Brazil have to offer beyond their challenges, while the studio still explains what they have to offer. In the context of colonial saviorism and the white savior industrial complex, the absence of such information implicitly feeds notions of heroism on the studio's behalf. Furthermore, language is often accredited as being an essential component of culture, where it acts as a vessel to communicate thoughts, beliefs, and customs. Hence, language, like in the case of the Global Housing Studio, can be used to perpetuate a them versus us narrative, which was also communicated in colonialism with repetition of terms like the other and the other half. Conversely, there is little attempt to reconcile this to create the we, which is imperative in a global climate where cross-geographical and cross-cultural collaboration seems inevitable, but it is an essential ingredient for these partnerships to be positively impactful. A further example of language being used to establish notions of perceived superiority and division between different stakeholders within the caste hierarchy was the imposing of colonial languages. This was enforced without effort to equally learn indigenous, African, Asian, or American languages. I'm referring to the entire North and South America, Central and South America. English is now a global lingua franca that can be used to aid communication between people of different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. However, by using other languages, we also allow ourselves to be exposed to realities, knowledge, and ideas that exist and are expressed in other contexts to inform and also deepen our own. Linguists note how language shapes our understanding of the world, meaning that these understandings are limited by the tools that the languages we speak offer. For example, as Oyunga said before, Africa's Ubuntu largely means I am because we are, which could develop the West's understanding of the interconnectedness between people, the environment, and community. In regards to the university, if the Global Housing Studio consistently uses other languages like Amharic and Addis Ababa to inform their practice, students would perhaps better understand the cultural nuances of the context they're operating in. It would then be translated in how they learn and the products that they eventually produce. Oh, excuse me. And now moving on to the last theme. What is the significance of understanding our value systems? How and who created them? Values can be defined as standards that are used to inform the actions and priorities of individuals and collectives to achieve certain goals. It is argued that the selection and dissemination of knowledge are indicative of who holds power and what their value systems are. Oftentimes, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are used as standards to guide projects. In the case of the Global Housing Studio, they were helpful in framing questions to drive design and research inquiries, which they can be. However, the SDGs and other such universal standards should be examined. Who created them? What were their intentions, and are they actually truly inclusive? For instance, it can be argued that the values of globalized concepts, like that of the UN's understanding of sustainable development, theoretically align with positive values, but practically deny it. Although the UN preaches universalism, their values are rooted in European and North American systems that perpetuate notions of European superiority, which silence other value systems. For instance, in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were put into effect with the intention of establishing universal aims to address political, environmental, and economic challenges affecting the world. But they were actually conceived 3 years prior at a UN conference in Rio. The number of which 50,000 attendees were there. The number of participants was intended to outwardly represent the inclusivity of the SDGs. Nonetheless, Raoni Metukiri, a chief of Brazil's indigenous Kayapo tribe, explained how he found himself repeating what he had already said at a similar conference 20 years ago, because what he had to say was neither listened to nor respected. Additionally, there may be more appropriate standards or goals born from and reflective of the context and its mechanisms that render collaborations more useful. Take another example from the UN and their Security Council, where most of the issues on the agenda pertain to Africa. However, of the available 26 seats, there are no seats that are permanently occupied by Africans. Wouldn't it be helpful to understand what values inspire action in these contexts to better solve the problem? But also, I implore you to not blindly accept these standards and goals, but explore the wider context that surrounds them and which they exist in. And lastly, are there other pluralities and ways of being educated? Colonial epistemological constructs typically invalidated local forms of history and values in favor of upholding Eurocentric design and knowledge canons. For example, MIT's Unmaterial Design Studio, based in Kenya, utilized knowledge canons that originated from a very Western-centric value system, which contributed to its limited success. This occurred without equally valuing the local forms of knowledge that were better grounded in the political, social, and economic context of the projects, which ultimately led to the course's perceived irrelevance or failure. Equally, the Global Housing Studio demonstrated a Western-centric hegemony of education by way of implicit bias. Furthermore, there seems to be a reluctance or misguided assumption that there are no other knowledge paradigms to be found in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, which is contrary to the intention of being collaborative. Instead, colonial racial beliefs are unknowingly communicated, such as the supposed superiority of Western thinking, that no other knowledge paradigms are as advanced and therefore beneficial for progress. Therefore, it could be beneficial for the course to facilitate the challenging of students' implicit biases. And to conclude, and to hark back to the words of James Baldwin at the beginning of the presentation, history, as we are learning, is not merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. So it is up to us to change the course of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca Beau. And you will be with us again in 10 minutes. But first we're going to listen to a presentation by Fatima Delgado Medina. She teaches sustainable and circular entrepreneurship and circular human behavior, as already said, here at Delft. But she has more than 10 years of experience in sustainability science and climate change, research applied to startups and on-site projects in the regions of the South Americas, Europe and the US.
Okay, now it's my turn after Rebecca and as well Oyunga, and I'm a little bit nervous how can I bring more contribution to the topic, but yeah, let's continue. So, I'm coming from the Delft Center for Entrepreneurship. We have a minor program that is called International and Entrepreneurship. International Entrepreneurship and Development minor program. Sorry for the date. And yeah, I also was questioning and talking to you like what would be my perspective about doing this presentation. Should I be doing like as a lecturer, as a staff, or as an individual? So I will combine different perspectives when I'm telling or sharing the storytelling what is happening within my experience in the minor, but also how we are trying to encounter different topics that have been embracing about decolonizing the way that the students are working or developing a challenge-based course or a challenge project in the Global South, which is very challenging but very, very nice to share. So a little bit about me. I'm from Ecuador, Latin America. I will say that my country is the world of the four worlds because we are blessed with different types of ecosystems from the Galapagos Islands, the Amazon rainforest, the highlands, and the Pacific coast in just a small piece of land in the middle of South America. And in that way, kind of connected to the work experience that I did there. I worked many years with different vulnerable groups from indigenous communities, smallholder farmers, women, single women associations, how to make them to, or help them to design what could be business project or business idea to improve their livelihoods. And in that process, I also lived and started to try to launch my own climate action project in Barcelona together with a fellowship with Cornell University and so other fellows across the world, how we can change or try to improve our behaviors in terms of different topics that are now everywhere about what we can do from our individual, but also from the community-based perspective to change the different challenges when it comes to climate change from the community perspective. And then now I'm here, the last year and a half in the Netherlands. And yeah, the minor has been lasting for the last 16, 17 years. Every year we have around 60 students from different faculties, but not only from the TU Delft, but also from Erasmus, Leiden, and other Dutch universities. We have around 20 challenges every year, and for every challenge we have a project provider or kind of say on-site supervisor. So that means there has to be a local organization that is already embedded in the local context. They already have some kind of familiarity to work with intercultural settings of students, and also they already have some kind of reputation in the context. And yeah, this is kind of the main objective of the minor, like how to help the students to work abroad, to develop technical solutions for complex challenges that will contribute to societal economic development. And yeah, there is many wordings and many parts of the main objectives of the minor that can be questioned as well from the colonize and decolonize and neocolonize perspective. But then the main thing about the minor is like we are also trying to embed this kind of challenge-based learning. That means that the solutions are not only coming or from the student's perspective, but also have to come along with the process that they build up with the stakeholders, with the local stakeholders. That makes it more interesting. So it's not that we offer, okay, this is the list of the projects and the problems that you have to kind of solve in the 6 months program. It's a negotiation and, let's say, discussion and reflection process that even happens before they start the minor. So we are trying to make or narrow those bridges to say, we are not going to impose you, and this is the assignment that you have to do. Let's do it the other way. And during the minor, we also, it's very challenging as well how we all combine the students because they are coming from different technical backgrounds. Sometimes we don't have that kind of social studies background that might also be fitting the discussion in the course or in the different groups. But by having multidisciplinary teams to solve a challenge, that also bring a lot of discussion when and how to start the problem, especially the problem discovery. Some of the projects that we launched last year, the majority are kind of 70–80% are concentrated in Africa. Then we are now working a little bit to kind of widespread and make it more diversified, not only in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, and recently some projects in Ecuador, obviously, but for next year, here are some of the projects and the locations, and that comes along with different challenges because, yeah, the cultural setting, the cultural values, and the challenges, let's say, are different. But we are really, really, really looking like, by having these challenge projects, there are obviously the technical component is intrinsically belonging to the project, but we also want to make this contribution when it comes to entrepreneurship. Yeah, because it comes along how we can improve the capabilities of local communities together with them, together with the guidance of local stakeholders to make these projects reality. So instead of explaining the list of projects, which is not necessary, I just wanted I'm going to share a video about these 3 projects that we did. The first one is Americas University, or in Spanish, La Universidad de las Américas, which is located in the capital city of Quito, Ecuador. And that was a project to recover urban water streams in the capital city. We did it together with municipality of the capital city of Quito, local neighborhood organizations, and the students. It means like the project was already alive and it was already happening when the students were part. So we kind of give this challenge, which is part of a major project, to say to students, okay, now you can own the project, work together with the local organizations, with the local stakeholders, but it's not that they are just jumping on and say, okay, we are going to just rule the project by our own from scratch. Then we have another project, which is Soma Life in Ghana, in the northern region of Ghana. And that was, it's a social enterprise that was founded by 2 Delft students. They were in the minor 3 years ago, and after that experience, they say, okay, we want to kind of maybe having this white savior attitude to say what else we can do. But the interesting part of this is like they also say, okay, let's have kind of this more horizontal kind of way of interaction and relationship with the different stakeholders. And they are working with a female, with different leaders that are happening, or they are already doing some work in the field for many years in that area. So that's a really nice part, because it's like we are not imposing. We have to find a way to co-create whatever is the solution for these women that they live, and they live for sheep butter processing of sheep butter products. And then we have Resupport Indonesia, and Resupport is also a 2 Delft startup. But then we found a partner in the local field that is all Indonesia Bureau Foundation. So we were matching different stakeholders to make them to work on the project. That's a really nice part to see as well. I think I have to take it, no, doesn't work. I have to make it manually.
The location where we were currently at will be in the bottom right corner. As you can see, we're now at the Lago Sofina stream. And now we're at the Efrata school, and we were just checking out the old greenhouse they had. It was very neglected and overgrown, as you can see. So we needed to do something about that, and this was the farmland surrounding it. So yeah, we had a lot of planning sessions, as you can see here, and this basically was just us with our supervisor Angela at the UTLA, and we would make plans for the next few weeks or the next week, and yeah, get everyone on the same page, as you can see.
Amazing. So this is it. This is the foundations of the Coral Lab.
This is it. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. Doing today?
We're here today for the big day with the builders. They're going to start building tomorrow, today. And we brought the contracts that we did set up. You can see them here. We got the stamp, so it's gonna be official today.
The design goes from just on the computer to suddenly it's like here in front of you.
It's the first time for us as well that actually did this.
There we go.
Easy.
For you.
Lama dia, 20 harian ya. And some card.
Here in Ghana, in the Upper West region, Soma Life is working on the empowerment of rural women and their children. They help women to become individual entrepreneurs and inspire their children to dream. As a social enterprise, they strive to give more opportunities to rural farmers to create valuable products. Shea butter is made from the shea nut, and by grinding, mixing and adding water, shea butter is created.
The rate at which we are losing the shea tree is alarming. Shea trees are being cut down for charcoal production and construction. So the reason why we are planting trees, shea trees, is to replace the lost ones and make sure that they do not go extinct, or we do not lose the shea trees in the coming years. We believe in sustainable sourcing, production and consumption. So replacing the shea trees and making sure that we plant alternatives for firewood is the best for us and for the whole ecosystem.
It was the reason why we chose the Seedling Project as our main project in focus. The Seedling Project's mission is to create a system that simulates behavioral changes and incentivizes women to grow shade trees. In the future, we want to plant 15,000 shade trees each year.
So, we can bring later in the question and discussion about what was the video, but the video, can you see kind of in a nutshell 3 projects that came along within the minor. The first, the intervention when it comes to the ecological pollution that is happening in the urban river streams in the capital city of Ecuador. The second one was by creating a coral, one of the first coral reef labs in the Lombok Island, which is the second biggest island in Indonesia, by kind of putting into practice some new technologies to coral reef restoration and also coral reef dissemination. So that means that the lab was part of the process, but then they have to go into the sea. And the third project was more into Soma Life is already working in Ghana, but then there was kind of like, okay, it's like a endless loop cycle where women are working, or their main materials, raw materials, are sheep or trees, but there is no system to kind of make or impulse conservation, even though it's one of their main inputs for their products. So these are kind of the key learning goals that we have in the minor. What we want to develop existing and new entrepreneurial competences on the students, but also how to make them to be engaged within a different cultural context and understand what kind of the relationships, how we can question development, aid of trade, sustainability and impact. What does really impact for different projects have different, meanings. But then, from a lecture perspective, sometimes we have want to help someone. I don't know if you know this guy, Ernesto Ciroli. He's an Italian Latin economy, a sustainable development catalyst. And then you want to help someone, the basic, principle, shut up and listen. And sometimes it's hard to make this kind of transferring this statement to the students, because of their cultural value settings, the way that we have been educated. Okay, I just want to contribute, I just want to make impact, but it has to be the opposite. What if is like one of the students that we have, and I wanted just to mention this, just because we just assume that more is better. So what is value? What is impact in the context that we live and the context other peoples are living? And if the problem is really a problem for you or for them, or is because in the way that we, I don't know, any technical or any research technique that you use empirical or whatever, waterfall or rural problem, that's the rural problem or the waterfall problem or way of doing research that you have in mind, because that's the way that you have been lectured, that you have been encountering in your educational setting. But when you go there, but that all is as well aligned to your cultural values, to the different, how to say, and the context that you are also living. That makes it, an influence in the whole thing. And not only that, but also, I also bring this slide to the first class that I give in this program. What are the reference or the literature reference that we have in mind, especially when you explore for Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And I cannot force to the students, okay, we have 2 months to do the lectures that are kind of mandatory on the minor program, and then you have to work 3 months on the internship on the field, and then these are some of the recommendations that I do for them. And then the one that is more familiar and more alike to my cultural or my value settings is the last one, Nemonti Nenkimo, which is an indigenous leader from the Guarani indigenous community, and she was chosen by one of the most top, the 100 top most influenced people from the time last year. And I don't want to talk more about what she said. I just wanted to share this video because what I'm like being the role of the lecturer on the process the students are designing the project. I just bring in these kind of momentums to them to reflect. How are you conducting the project? What are your references? Who are you interviewing? Okay, the tools that we use, I don't know, I don't know if you know multi-level perspective paradigm or the quadruple, quintuple, helix model. There are many models to understand what are kind of the different interrelationships that are happening in a mapping system of the actors that are happening in a context. Yeah, the models are useful, but some of them can be very wrong. But we just give the students the opportunity to reflect on the tools, to make the kind of the research desk, but also to reflect what are the references that you have been taught all your life. And we need, and we are, or from my perspective, I'm not talking about to Delft, or from my contribution to the program is like forcing them to just see the other side of the world. Okay, it's not helping. Okay, here we are.
En la cultura guaraní decimos que cuando las mujeres hacen oír sus voces es porque algo está mal con el planeta y necesitamos actuar rápido. Las mujeres están conectadas con la tierra y la naturaleza, les está avisando sobre estos problemas. Para la gente de ciudades, yo les pregunto, ¿qué está escuchando? ¿A quién están escuchando? ¿Son sus ancestros? ¿Son las mujeres? ¿Es la naturaleza? Para mí es muy claro ahora que las mujeres están protestando no solo en la Amazonía ecuatoriana, sino en todo el mundo. Nosotras estamos tomando partido por el planeta. Yo vivo en la selva, nací en la selva, mis ancestros, mis abuelos vivieron en la selva y ellos me enseñaron cómo cuidar de la tierra. Como pueblos indígenas durante miles de años hemos luchado por proteger nuestra tierra. Nosotros proveemos el aire puro y el agua, no solo para nuestras gentes, sino para el mundo entero. Luchamos para proteger la vida misma. Aun si ustedes no pueden verla la selva, estamos conectadas a través de la tierra, porque estamos sobre el mismo suelo, siempre estamos conectados. Sin embargo, hemos alcanzado un punto donde los pueblos indígenas no pueden seguir luchando solos. El mundo entero necesita parar y pensar a quién está escuchando, a quién es lo que estamos dejando a las futuras generaciones. Yo les invito a que paren un momento y escuchen las voces de las mujeres indígenas. ¿Son ustedes un buen ancestro? ¡Feliz Día de la Tierra!
Just to finalize because I think I extended myself a lot, I don't know. Reflecting on this video and what are kind of the SDGs, if you hear these voices about indigenous communities, they were saying the same. for many centuries. And this is part of the ancestral heritage, which is part of the ancestral baggage, and kind of like one of these articles that I was kind of reflecting before is this kind of content or knowledge is usually not fitting the Western canon. So as students and also as a staff, we also need to kind of criticize what is happening with the current status quo in the mainstream contemporary academic field. Because if we consider these other voices when we are designing a project, designing a product, or whatever project you are involved in your bachelor program or master or PhD, you will see, okay, is the problem that I already figured out or already identified the real problem for them or not? And how can we encounter this? By having these reflection moments that we are trying to encounter in the program, but it's still difficult. There are students that there are more, I don't want to entitle or say, yeah. There are students that are more open to do that because they also find their own intrinsic passion. How can I bring impact? But yeah, I will question the way that I also want to do impact. So I will do further research than the one that is taught on class or not. And the experience for creating impact where it's needed. This is a really nice example that is also happening in Zanzibar, which is with this project or this social enterprise that is called Chaco. And the real nice, from the student perspective, what happened, no? And I'm just going to repeat, this is who is in the picture. Ilse and these other two students, but Ilse quoting about the minor, about her experience, like what I think the most important thing is that the minor taught me is how to communicate with people despite language barriers and how to work together despite our different cultures. Working and living in a different culture was really an eye-opening to me because it shows you how different people can live their lives, what different priorities they have. It really gives you a new perspective of the world. So that's the experience that kind of, besides the learning experience or the educational experience, is like being the eye-opening to see how the privilege system that is happening in the Netherlands is all completely opposite what you can see in other parts of the world. And then we have this project from the Coral Reef. These guys were amazing, and here in the middle we have Andrea, which is the project supervisor, and he's also working with different local universities. And what he said about the minor and about the project, like there are different challenges. It's not only the social challenge, but also the lack of awareness of coral reefs, even though more than the 50% of coral reefs have been already devastated in that area of Indonesia. The lack of resources to restore. So this is more like a landscape view of not only the economical or the local view, but also the lack of resources to restore and protect coral reefs. And global warming is not stopping soon enough to save the corals. So it was like a more call to action from his perspective, not only from Indonesia, but also from other parts of the world that are also encountering the same problem. So at the end of the day, I would say that these kind of societal challenges or societal problems that are coming not only from the social perspective, but also the ecological disruption that is happening are making the students to be aware of more. And yes, I think I'm going to finish, and that's it. Just a gathering of pictures of the students, also living the experience of the minor. And yes, that's it.
Rebecca and Fatima, if you please want to sit and we can discuss some stuff together. If you want to sit over here.
Yeah.
Maybe have some water after your talks. So, yeah, Fatima, to start with you, what did you recognize from the talk from Rebecca? Because you're not in the global housing program, right? But with regard to like the issue of, say, language or impact making, what did you recognize?
I think the most important, there were two things that recon on me when you're with your presentation, is the SDGs relevance, for whom is relevant, and why do we take that framework in consideration to kind of measure and identify what is sustainable development, no matter your culture, no matter where is your background, no matter the ecological and societal, context for different parts of the world. But the SDGs are encountered in all the programs and all the educational programs across TU Delft. And the second one, what are the references that we have? Yeah. And
yeah, because you gave this list of literature, but then you said like, yeah, but I cannot force my students to read this, but how does that work? I mean, if you are a student, when I was a student, you were kind of forced to read the literature because you had to make exams about it.
Yeah.
But is this different? Like, is this more like an optional thing, or how does it work?
Yeah, because I lecture a course that is called Development, Sustainability and Impact. Mm-hmm. So even the title can be questioned. But yeah, the thing is like, it's part of the, let's say, the organization of the minor is not only comes to my decision. So that means that I can decide the literature reference and so on, but I need to be kind of align for those who are professors or lecturers, you have to align everything. So if I have a course that is called more like intercultural or the colonization of in project design, I will use more those reference. Yeah. So every time that I have the opportunity, I will bring those reference, because depends also, the reference can change from one culture to another culture. I brought the Monte Nenkimo, but that she would be more aligned to the reality of South America, or the countries that are aligned or are in the region of the Amazon rainforest, or for those indigenous communities that have similar values. Yeah. So because of the list of the projects that you see, we are, 20 projects in 19 countries.
Yeah, it has to make sense, of course. But Rebecca, what do you remember from your curriculum? Like, because I read some of the books you used for your thesis, but were this also the books that were handed out to you while you were following the courses and the classes?
No.
No. What was the material you had to work with while you were?
So we had one course that predecessed the actual writing of the thesis, and this was like a stepping stone to becoming more or a little bit familiar for the entire class with themes of race and colonialism and that interrelation with architecture. But a lot of it was from discussions with peers and friends and family about what resources are actually available. But I also did my bachelor's at TU Delft as well, and yes, they were heavily Western-centric, and if you wanted to go beyond those realms, it was very much an individual task, and if you were interested in doing so. But perhaps sometimes there wasn't even a realization that, this culture over here could also have very deep knowledge about a specific topic or subject.
Yeah, because Fatima, you're working here from 1.5 years now or something, and what did you, are people really open to change, the curriculum and to add new works and maybe say, well, this is not so relevant anymore? Do you feel that there is a dynamic going on, or is it a very slow process?
I would say there is intention to do that, but it's a slow process because the mainstream way of doing academia is English. So that can be also like obstacle for how to connect in the language setting with the different projects that are happening in different parts of the world. So even we had some problems to convince other colleagues to include projects in Latin America. But I'm saying, maybe in some regions of Africa, English is more like a second language. Sometimes it's like a more formal language. But in some areas of Latin America, we have a project in the middle of the Amazon, and they say, yeah, the students, they will not care or they will not choose because there is language barrier.
Yeah.
So there is intention, but sometimes you have to keep pushing or keep convincing people that,
Yeah, of course.
Could I add? I also, sorry, I'm a student at TU Delft, but I also work as a student assistant at Leiden University, as Fatima, as Mirta explained earlier, on a similar course actually called Frugal Innovation for Sustainable Global Development, which can also be questioned, the title. But I think also when you introduce new knowledge canons and literature, it's not merely enough to do that act, but there also needs to, I wrote it down here, but there also needs to be adaptation and a revision in how they're actually taught, because they don't come from the same value or cultural system. So there also needs to be a change in how they're presented and how they're approached.
And maybe also who teaches it, because what are your thoughts on when you get taught about the Global South, for example, do you think the professor or the teacher should be from the Global South, to give the course?
Okay, it's funny because yesterday I was in an event from the Latin Student Association from Delft, and we were discussing about are we the average Latin person in the Netherlands or not? And we were saying, yeah, we may not be the average Latin person or Latin, how to say, whatever stereotype you have, but we also were questioning how can we make that switch?
What do you mean with the average Latin person?
Because the kind of the opportunities or the path that you have to build up to be here.
Yeah, it means you're very privileged.
You might say you are very privileged within your community. Yeah. Okay. But if everyone has a story, so my story will say, yeah, I was able to cross the Atlantic because I had the opportunities to get a scholarship. Yeah, the scholarship is open to everyone, but to be prepared to obtain that scholarship, I could afford in my country to have private education because public education is barely
But then
nothing.
would you say, if you put it harshly, then it doesn't really matter whether, a professor from Western Europe or from Latin America is teaching it. It's more about what your socioeconomic or class is, decides whether you can really teach about this.
I think it's more, maybe I wanted to connect what I was saying, what we were discussing yesterday. Is more like to teach about the Global South, you have to also experience it. So you cannot teach or run a project or run a thesis from the desk. So Ernesto Soroli, and if you find him in TED Talk, he was saying, yeah, we were working 7 years in Zambia, and we just find out that all the 8 or NGO projects were failing, not only in the Italian NGOs, the US, the UK, and from many of the Western NGOs that were failing, but then when that switch happened, when we were immersed and mingle with the locals. And that takes a process, and that means you have to be there for a meet or a long-term process, not for every 3 or 5 year project.
But then, Rebecca,
funding.
For who do you think these projects we were just presented with, because those students are only going for a couple of months actually abroad, and for who is the project? Is it for the student or is it for the partner organization over there, you think?
That is the big question. And I think partly building on to what Fatima has just said is, I think even when you go abroad, so when students go abroad, it's very easy, even if you go from the Netherlands to Ghana or to Indonesia or Ethiopia, it's very easy to maintain within your bubble of comfort, even when abroad. So I think it's about how students are equipped to actually go beyond these comfort bubbles when they are abroad, to actually be better immersed in these environments, because it can happen, but I don't think a lot of the times at universities like TU Delft that we're equipped with skills to actually do this when we leave.
But then is it more, so there is still a lot for the students to learn, maybe on a technical level, and also to expand your horizon, which we heard in your reviews, like, students. But then is there a real objective? Is the partner organization like really asking, like, please send us these students from the Netherlands, because within a period of 3 months they can really, in a sustainable way, help us to improve, the way that we set up our programs here?
Usually these organizations, they are collaborating with other local regional universities, and for a specific challenge they ask us, okay, can we have a group of bachelor students that can help us from this specific task? So the owner of the project, or the ownership of the project, relies on the local organization. So but we try to give to the, because as well is the way that the educational setting is happening in the Netherlands. The students have a lot of independence, and they are always claiming for ownership. So you say, okay, do that. You own the project, but you need to have this cooperative setting in the whole process, before, during, and after. So, and I think one of the main questionings or criticism to the minor is like, okay, how can we, let's say, guarantee the continuation of these projects? Are just going to be a white savior for 3 months? For some projects it happens. For other projects, we are avoiding this kind of mentality. But it's a long process that needs to take into account. And as I said, I'm just one person for the minor program, and I can only talk about my own reflection.
I didn't know that because I'm not from TU Delft, but I heard that there is the can-do mentality here, and it has to do with, people are very eager to build stuff and always think in this kind of constructive way. Like, first there isn't something, or there's a problem, and I think it's already funny that it's called challenges, because even, with my children, everything is brought to them as a challenge, and I think it's this challengeation of the world. Like, this challenge, it also has something like, it's a game, or it's, while for a lot of people it's their actual, reality. It's not the challenge. So, but that's just my observation. But what I want to ask you is, when there is a can-do mentality, really, Rebecca, how can you change a mentality of students into more like a listening mentality, as you pointed out?
This is the big question again. But I think within the architecture faculty, for example, I did my bachelor's and then various masters in the same faculty, and I think that it's approached from a very can-do attitude. So, for example, actually engaging with different stakeholders, or actually finding out what the people you're designing homes for want. That was very much like, if you were interested in it, then that's what you would do. But I think it's time for there to be systems and methods that come from the university, so a collaboration from top down and bottom up, that actually prompt students and encourage students, in fact, like make it mandatory for students to engage with people that they're going to be designing for or building for, because it makes no sense. For example, last year, during an architecture studio course where we had to design a school, my group and I, we asked various stakeholders within the school, so parents, students, teachers, and we asked one parent, and they said, "Oh, I don't think I'm qualified to give you to provide information about what a school should look like or how its architecture should be designed." But of course you are. It's about also empowering various stakeholders within the the project about how their opinions are also valued, and encouraging students to go and seek that information, which I don't think currently happens. But there are so many opportunities for that to happen in the architecture faculty, for example. but it's not mandated.
It's to me it seems that it's really how do you say it? It's all very voluntarily. Like if you are interested, if you are willing, yes, there is. But if you're not interested, you can just focus on the adventure and your technical skills and go anyway. I see when I look at the time, we are pretty late. Are there some? Do you have some questions? Yes. Maybe wait for a microphone, and because we are also recording this.
Thank you. Just talking about the sustainable goals, and the West asking the Global South about the sustainable goals, but has the West ever asked about, well, Becky talked about that, that their voices aren't heard, but when we look at sustainability, for example, who's sustainable? Whose cultures are sustainable? And I think about, I went to Copenhagen yesterday, myself and Becky went to Copenhagen. What happens when the tulips are finished? The ground,
No, you have to talk in the mic.
Oh, into it. So, yeah, I just think, how sustainable is the Netherlands, for example? And then we're talking about looking at sustainability elsewhere, but how sustainable are we here? And the other question is about the language. We always talk about the spoken language, but there is a heart language that nobody sees sometimes because we're so rooted in academia, but people don't always speak from an academic voice. They speak from a heart and a soul voice.
Shall I continue? Okay, I would say the most sustainable communities or societies, from my perspective, are indigenous communities. And they have been doing this for centuries. So when you see their practices from an observer without interfering, you will see many, not only in the Monte, but many indigenous communities, they say water is life, and life is part of water is part of every activity that we do. And you're just disrupting and coming here with this aphorism of what should be progress, what should be development, and then you're disrupting their world. And what happens to some of these communities during the pandemic is like they said, no, we don't want medical advice or medical attention because you are bringing the COVID. We are isolated. We have been isolated for many centuries. We decided when we want to enter to, how to say, the urban areas, but just leave us alone. But the local national government, they wanted to enter just to, because it was there is a pandemic and you had to fill in or follow the rules and regulations. And about what kind of practices you can do about, especially when it comes to project design, there is different kind of tools when it comes to empathy tools that can be embedded in the design thinking process. There is a one way to do it. But even to be empathetic in the Western culture, to one, even though we are in the same culture, is very difficult. It's not naturally embedded to us. So you have to keep practicing and to bring those moments in a course or in a program that the students can reflect. We give the tools. And also we should offer those safe spaces where reflection can also be can also happen. And there is a master thesis from industrial design that is called Power Literacy from Maya Woodwills, and what she is like. It's a master thesis from Design for Interaction, and it's like she gives kind of a framework and some tools to make designers, to invite them to critically reflect on their privilege, power, and the effect they will have in a project. So that can be a tool that might be nice to explore, and how can you embed it into your master thesis or whatever project design that you're doing.
And similarly, I also think that indigenous communities are the most sustainable, and this is why I also prompt you to question the SDGs. Like, they can be helpful, but there needs to be examination and critical examination of what they actually present. And I'll give you an example in terms of, so as we say, indigenous communities found in South America, in Africa, in Asia, they are most sustainable. But then if you look at SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production, one of their targets, it reads, support developing countries to strengthen their scientific and technological capacity to move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. I find this incredibly ironic. And if you look at maybe, Oyunga, you can elaborate further, but when I was reading and also having spent some time in Kenya, the Kikuyu and many other indigenous people, they see the earth as a medium to better commune and connect with their ancestors. So it's something sacred, and there's a spirituality aspect involved in actually caring and coexisting and living with the natural world, which is something that I feel is quite void in Western culture. So this is something that could undeniably actually result in creating and co-creating a more sustainable world. However, that's nowhere to be seen in the SDGs. It's actually the reverse. So.
And it's funny because the Ecuadorian government was labeling or using as a branding a Quechua phrase that it means summa causai, which means the well-being. And then everything was summa causai because, let's make the policy to integrate indigenous ancestral knowledge into the policy making. But then everything failed because it was a great, example of faking and just make it because, now it's mandatory and now we have to fill in and follow in what are the rules and regulations for many funding projects when it comes to SDGs. How many SDGs are you covering or not?
I think it's the same with diversity and inclusion now in the Netherlands as well. You know, that if you tick the boxes, you know, then it's okay. And but it's not real, or it's not grounded in like this. I think we have to wrap it up. Is there another question from you? You can maybe also ask, if you don't want to do it publicly later on with the drink. You are invited for a drink and a bite. And what should be the conclusion of this event? Like, is it pessimistic, optimistic? Are we slowly, do you see some, systematic change in thinking on these things? Or what are your conclusions, both of you?
I think I can see it happening a little bit in the urbanism department of the architecture faculty, and in the wider world, that there are rumblings of change in various different contexts. But for you guys here, I really, really encourage you to question what you may have otherwise blindly accepted. And especially when you're working in a context that's different to your own, or just generally in life, I think questioning is fantastic. And I think there is also there is no one more interesting than an interested person. So I think when you're working, in whether that be in the Netherlands or abroad, but I think to listen and to ask people what they actually want and to empower people, because we are in this together. We are a team, and I think there's been lots of division of, oh, I'm an expert in this and you don't know anything about this, so even though it affects you directly and me not at all, you'd know nothing about my practice and what I do. But I think like with the Ubuntu, I am because we are. I would encourage you to ask questions and to listen, because we are a team. We are because we all are together as well. We don't exist as an island. Yeah, thank you.
I would say that the topic is becoming more, or is becoming to the table more often. Not only the way that educational offering has to be organized, but also within the teams or within the staff level is also happening. But sometimes I feel that it's because we have to
check the boxes,
and sometimes the voice is not given. So I can sometimes my personal experience, I'm not going to generalize, but sometimes I feel like, okay, let's do these changes, let's bring more diversity when it comes to the projects that we bring to the minor, not only to some areas or to some regions of Africa, because Global South, but also changing the narrative, why we are saying is the Global South, or what does it mean to bring impact. But because we are in this environment, everything has to be measured, everything has to be like accounted, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Those kind of topics to discuss sometimes is hard, because you need to raise your voice, not only you, but many people to have this kind of transitional change when it comes to the way that we educate, we embedded the language, and just basic thing that happened in the minor. Like there was one female student that she chose to go to the project in the Amazon rainforest, but then she stepped aside and said, no, I have heard that Latin America is not a female friendly environment, and I wanted to switch to the Ghanaian project. And for many reasons or many situations that happened when she went to Ghana, it happened the opposite. And then also the stereotypes that comes along for a country, for a region, for a culture. So it takes a lot of process, and it's not only TU Delft responsibility, it has to come along before that. Otherwise, we were not going to change the world in a 10-week program.
I would like now to go to Mark van Huisdee, because he drew his conclusions.
Very short.
Yeah.
It's getting late for you, perhaps.
Maybe you can.
Perhaps
Yes.
someone can hold it up.
Yeah. Can somebody help? Yeah.
Okay. A very speedy summary, starting with Uyunga's presentation. What I really found interesting that he explained it's hard to escape from colonial legacy, and it was very clear in the examples he gave. So I drew you here in the slum, and it's very hard to get out. But it's very interesting what you explained, that by the community storytelling and working bottom up was a way, to go out this a difficult situation, and not in the way of NGOs and being dependent, but the bottom-up approach. From Rebecca, I found it interesting, as I understood it. So colonialism, that's over, but there is neocolonialism, but that's perhaps sometimes even worse. It's also bad because things are not implicit anymore. And so there's a lot happening under the surface that affects the cross-cultural collaboration. And things like notions, narratives, linguistics, maintaining power. So if these things should be more explicit, the collaboration could be better, is what I understood. Fatima, I was thinking about the embedded engineer, that you're also not looking from a distance, but you're part of the team, you connect and you understand well. So here the engineers are between the people and between the stakeholders, and they understand the context well. They look from the community perspective, so they are part of it. So that's what I took from the 3 presentations. And then I thought, can I give a recap? What does it mean for the Decolonial Campus? I think it's important to be aware what's happening beneath the surface. So we have to dig deeper at TU Delft, perhaps, to see what's else happening. Things are important, like to listen and to understand, to make things explicit, the communication. Then I thought, perhaps because we are engineers, we should build 3 machines. This is one machine that's pumping up the notions from beneath the surface to the surface, so we can be aware of what's happening beneath the surface. This is another machine. It makes things explicit, so things that are not said will be explicit here. Perhaps air goes in and solids goes out. And this is a new type of AirPods. You don't just listen, but you also understand what people are saying. So I think with these 3 interventions, it will be perfect at TU Delft.
There we have the can-do mentality again. really like your drawing. I just discovered that you did a lot of mansplaining.
Yeah.
But it's okay.
How do you mean? What?
Well, mansplaining is if you explain what women have been saying, but you did this, of course, because you're explaining your drawing.
Yes,
but
of course.
Yes, but
it's my own interpretation.
Yes,
so perhaps you get really mad what I made of it, but it's the way I looked at it. So.
Now, thank you very much, and
You're
I think
welcome.
we can all take a closer look at it, and it will also be put
scanned
online, right?
Yep.
And we can all watch it.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you all for your attention, and let's have a drink.